kind of brings us to Japan. And you've written a bit about Japan recently. Japan obviously is like the opposite of a nuclear threatening power, right? They're a country that since World War II has been essentially not only peaceful, but written into their constitution, they cannot have an attack military force. And there's a certain term for that, but they only have a self-defense force. They cannot go to war against someone else. They can only defend themselves, right? But there's some thinking that is changing in Japan in light of just recent things in China the last few years, and especially Russia, Ukraine. So what's going on there in Japan?
Well, Xi Jinping has managed to accomplish what, I say, successive U.S. administrations have not, and that's to get the Japanese to think seriously about defense. The Japanese approach for a long time was to either ignore potential problems or leave the hard work up to the Americans. But now you're actually starting to see a debate or discussion, and I think it's actually kind of decided on the Japanese side that they will fight to defend themselves. The Japanese self-defense force is considerable, but operationally it needs improvement to be able to do operations better, say joint operations. It needs some additional hardware to fill in some gaps. It needs to be able to work with the Americans better. But it really does have the basis of a nice, potent military force. And it always has had that, but they preferred to pretend it really isn't. But the Japanese have militarized a long time ago, or remilitarized, but they need to improve what they have. But it's that psychological part of the equation that the Chinese have been so successful at. Is over the last decade or so, they have applied such pressure on the Japanese that the Japanese have gradually come, and I say the Japanese, it's the political class, the official class, the public has been there for a long time. They've come around to the idea that they have to fight and defend themselves, and they cannot just rely on the United States. So that is a big change, and you see the way they say the Japanese and the Americans are training together for things that sure look a lot like fighting a war. The Japanese are sort of fortifying some of their islands down in the south with the necessary sorts of weapons. There's talk of doubling the defense budget, which they should have done a long time ago. But there's this psychological change that Japan has finally woken up, that they live in a dangerous neighborhood. The Chinese want Japanese territory, and they also want to teach the Japanese a lesson. There's this immense resentment bubbling up in Chinese psyches that, for past supposed historical wrongs, and they want to teach the Oni a lesson. Chinese will often use this this expression that refers to the Japanese as like demons or the dwarf pirates, and it's this sort of crude vulgarity like you would have heard in West Texas in 1950, talking about racial minorities. But that's just sort of how it's looked at by a nice slice of the Chinese population, of how they look at Japan. So Japan has woken, but it's got a long ways to go. But nonetheless, it's finally, I think the Americans might just have a real partner. But you combine the two militaries, the two capabilities, and it is impressive, and it is something that would give the Chinese pause. And there's been an expression, we used to hear it all the time from Japanese officers like 15 years ago, and it is that Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense. And if you look at the map, that makes perfect sense. And so part of some Japanese have understood it, but now it's really widely recognized. But one thing that you are seeing is the Japanese leadership is, as they usually do, they're looking to see what the Americans are going to do. And they will calibrate off of that, which is unfortunate because Japan ought to take the initiative. But they've gotten used to the idea of sort of looking from behind, seeing what the big guys are doing, and then following along. But I think the Japanese would indeed provide a considerable support and maybe even pitch in the event of a Taiwan scenario.
So we're going to put a map up on screen to show that region. What do you mean by Taiwan's defense is Japan's defense?
What I mean is if you look at the map, you have the Japanese archipelago stretching from north to south. Just below that, like 60 miles from the last Japanese island, is Taiwan. That is right next door. So it'd be like Coney Island is New York's defense. No, not quite, but
No, the enemy can take Coney Island.
yeah, as long as they don't take Nantucket. But what you have, if Taiwan, say, comes under Chinese control, at that point you have put the Chinese military in a position to outflank Japanese defenses, and they can get around the rear. If you head east from Taiwan over the sea, over the airspace, you are behind Japan's defenses. The Chinese military starts operating to the east, up to the north. They can surround Japan, and Japan could find itself isolated from the United States, from anywhere else. And a good chunk, like 80% of Japan's energy supplies, flow through the South China Sea. Taiwan sits astride the South China Sea. And so it is in a position to interdict, cut those sea lanes as well, and the sea lanes to the east also. So that's the sort of one of the immediate problems that Japan faces if they do find Taiwan under Chinese control, is that they're facing west pretty much to try and ward off the Chinese aggressors, and then you have Taiwan down to the south, then you have the Philippines after that. It's this so-called first island chain. If you think of it as, say, a castle wall being breached, if your part of the wall is still up, but the part next to you has collapsed and the enemy's pouring through, you can see I think you can sort of conceptualize the problem. And then there's the psychological aspect of, a China that has managed to bring to heel 23, 24 million free people, and the Japanese couldn't do anything about it. The Americans couldn't do anything about it. You'd find most countries in Asia very quickly trying to cut the best deal they could with the People's Republic of China. And once again, that isolates Japan, puts it in a very precarious position.
Do you think that the Chinese Communist Party would go so far as to attack some of those Japanese islands that are close to Taiwan?
I think they would. It can be argued. There's different ways to argue it. And if you gave me $20 an hour, I could probably come up with a reason to say they wouldn't. The reason they wouldn't is because they don't want to bring in the Japanese. They don't want to hit the Americans and bring in the Americans. But if they ignore it, they will. Then they can tell both of those countries, stand back. We're just settling this internal matter. But as a practical matter, I think they would have to. They would need to sort of protect their left flank as it is, and also to make it harder for the Americans and the Japanese to intervene. So I would expect that there would be attacks on Japanese territory in the event of a Chinese assault on Taiwan. But also another thing that the Chinese will, of course, have noticed is that everyone is able in Ukraine is that the civilized world, Europe, the EU, is able to focus just on Ukraine. There's nothing to distract them. So what you would expect, actually, in the event of a Taiwan scenario, is you would expect North Korea to launch some major provocation that forces the Americans, forces the Japanese, and certainly forces the South Koreans to sort of look west at the Korean Peninsula, devote attention, resources to that. You might even get the Russians cooperating. So all this prevents the Americans, the Japanese, from focusing on Taiwan exclusively. So that would be something that unfortunately the Chinese have probably figured out from looking at the Ukraine situation. And of course, any time Kim Jong-un, the North Korean dictator, launches a missile, does a nuclear test, he does that with Chinese permission. If China wanted to, it could turn off the spigots, the economic support, financial support to North Korea, and close the place down in an afternoon practically. So it's not as if North Korea is this independent actor. What it does, it suits Chinese needs. So when the time comes with Taiwan, as I do expect some distractions, here and there, courtesy of the North Koreans, the Russians, and probably the Iranians getting involved as well.